Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again this week. More happy than you may even know. Earlier this week I had surgery, and so it's been a rough go trying to get back at stuff, and it's a balancing act to try to get to feel healthy enough to be able to want to do things, and also just being able to actually do it. So it's as I sit here today, this is the first day that I've actually kind of sat up the whole day, so it's been interesting. Having abdominal surgery is never a fun situation. So anybody that has experienced that, you know what it feels like. And maybe I'm a baby, but this week hasn't gone as well as I was expecting. So, but it's over. I haven't been able to attend a lot of stuff, been able to do stuff remotely, just kind of paying attention. But, we're going to get back into it, hoping that things have turned around and we'll be able to be on the mend moving forward without, drugs and other stuff in my system. So, yeah. So let's get into this. There's a lot to talk about today, but first, before I do that, let me tell you about our partners, Black Desert Resort. Black Desert Resort isn't just your home, it's an endless retreat where life is played your way, from intimate studios to spacious 4-bedroom suites. The raw beauty of southern Utah is your new backyard. Discover its championship golf course, exquisite dining, and world-class outdoor adventures, all yours to conquer. This is luxury your way. Learn about owning a luxury residence at blackdesertresort.com. Come play, come stay. All right, so it was kind of frustrating to me because I had this surgery scheduled for Monday, thinking that, hey, I'll be able to be fine early on in the week. I don't have too much stuff. Anything else that I need to do can be done remotely, so I'll be okay. And then Utah decided to go schedule a press conference for its football coach and the 2 coordinators on Tuesday. And as much as I wanted to be there and told people that I potentially would be there, it just didn't go as planned. There was no way I was going to get up there. My body was not functioning very well to be able to do that. Would be in a lot of pain, and it would have taken me 10 minutes just to walk into the building. So there was the press conference on Tuesday, which was Kyle Whittingham, Morgan Scalley, and Jason Beck. This is the first time we've gotten to talk to Jason Beck, or the media got to. I obviously wasn't there, as I mentioned. And so this was a great opportunity to kind of recap what had happened since the offseason began, right? Utah did not do its traditional signing day press conference, mostly because Utah was thick in the transfer portal, trying to get guys to sign, trying to get an offensive coordinator and staff. And we've documented this, so I don't need to get into it too much, but it was a busy time. And so, us as media had been requesting that we get a chance to talk to, Kyle or Jason, and they decided to kill, 3 birds with one stone? Is that what we're doing here? And got the head man and, his 2 top assistants in the coordinator world to be able to come. So great opportunity to be able to hear from them, hear their takes on kind of what has transpired over the last little bit. And so today's podcast is going to be pretty heavily football. I know I said the last time that we were going to probably start shifting over to basketball, but that was without knowing that we were going to have this plan. And I think a majority of you probably like talking about football more anyways. And so this becomes a great off-season conversation. So coming from that press conference, there was a big emphasis on the word culture. That's always been kind of Kyle's MO, right? Like he's built a program where regardless of the talent that he's brought in there, he's tried to do what he can to say that Utah does it, their own way, right? And every school can say that. They can point to it, and culture is kind of the word that they use. But I think more at Utah, people believe that a little bit more simply because of the sustainability, the longevity that this coaching staff has had. Obviously, Kyle's been at the program for 20 years as just the head man, longer, obviously, as an assistant and other things that way. But even his staff, for the most part, has stayed relatively the same, right? There's guys that come and go and everything. And, Morgan Scalley's been with the program for a long time and has been there. And they've built, especially on that defensive side, a pretty strong system where they keep guys. And many of those guys on that coaching staff, especially on the defensive side of the ball, have been up for different jobs. Morgan Scalley's obviously been recruited. You've got Colton Swan that's been recruited, Sharif Shaw. You've got all these guys, and I apologize for missing other people, Lewis Powell, and I'm drawing a blank. You get it. But these guys have been recruited from to other places, right? And there's top dollars that are going there because Utah has done a good job on the defensive side of being able to identify talent and keeping them there. And so that culture, that big buzzword that everybody likes to use, is generally, it rings more true at Utah than many places because of what Utah's been able to do that way. And so, even in this NIL era, the transfer portal era, the coaching staff still wants to embrace that, right? They still want to be able to have this culture where it's sustainable. And as though you bring new players into this, and Utah's going to bring in essentially a 50% new roster, you're still trying to get them to buy into this culture in the way that you do it. And so beyond the money and everything, there's a way that Utah goes about doing things. And so, I wanted to be able to splice up that interview, the press conference, but I just honestly haven't had time this week based on kind of how I've been feeling. So I'm going to read some different things. I apologize for that. I know I usually give you guys audio, and I know you get tired of hearing my voice, but, I'm going to read a few of these things just to kind of give you what they say, listen to it with their voice in mind. I'll be better. But as a one-man show right here, this is what you get. So Whittingham talked about the challenges that being able to maintain that culture provide. Obviously, bringing in a bunch of new guys, it's not as simple as it used to be, he said. It's not something that they can just have this naturally strong culture where you stay in the program, you mature in it, you stay there for 3-4 years, and by year 2 or 3, maybe you get into the starting unit, and then you develop and continue to grow there. These are the players that we've seen recently where you can take a Devin Lloyd who was talented, but he didn't become the first round draft pick like he was without that maturation. That's not to say he couldn't have done that, but that's how Utah's always kind of identified those guys, is they've found guys that weren't always the top rated player. They weren't always these guys that they, expected to be the 4 or 5 star corner, and they develop into him to be an even better. It's finding a guy like Isaiah Vaughn, who was a quarterback, and keeping him in the system throughout his entire tenure at Utah and developing him into one of the better cornerbacks in the conference. Obviously, you can find different players to do that, and there's still guys that do it. There's still many, especially on the defensive side of the ball, that have found that sticking with Utah is generally the best option, right? That's not to say that other programs can't develop, right? There's a lot of great coaching and a lot of great talent out there, but Utah's had that consistency. And so as much as money does talk, the consistency on the defensive side especially has been a great asset for Utah to be able to maintain some of these guys, right? Obviously, you have a guy like Lander Barton. Maybe he could have sought going to the NFL, and there was real conversations about doing that. Does he come back and decide to come back there? There's Smith Snowden. Obviously, there was all the distractions about him going to BYU and trying to go there. Going to BYU, I don't think he would have been in a bad spot because learning from Jay Hill would have been a great system. But he's got a good thing at Utah, and that's where he wants to stay. You can pick out a lot of these players that even in the NIL era, that they still want to stay and maintain a spot there, right? As much as money matters, and it does matter, and we'll get into some of that of what they talked about with that, it's about consistency and trying to get you to the next level. So there is that. As part of that, though, as part of that challenge, Whittingham talked about, to create that strong culture. He says it's up to them to educate, indoctrinate, and them, meaning the players, to indoctrinate the new guys into how we do things. And we have a certain way of doing things here, and we expect that to continue. So Utah's going to continue to embrace that, right? This is one of those things that they're going to continue to do. It's not something that they're going to shy away with just because it's an NIL era and, your roster is completely new from the last year. They're going to continue to try to embrace that. The challenge is trying to find those leaders that will be able to kind of lead that on, right? It's one thing to be able to have Kyle Whittingham or Morgan Scalley or Sharif Shah or any of these other coaches preach that into the players, but it's another when you have somebody next to you, who's in the thick of it with you, who's leading you along and understands that culture. That's where Utah's trying to embrace this even more. It's trying to identify those leaders early, trying to make sure that they understand that culture and understand what it means to be a Utah man and moving forward. Scalley talked about, he's saying, part of my job is to continue to maintain and strengthen the culture that we have. I truly believe that culture does matter, and for those that it doesn't matter to, that's okay. We're going to get the right guys in this program. We have very good support. We have very good NIL. Another thing is people want to donate money to good people, good programs. We've got a very good program. Kyle Whittingham has done nothing but establish class and doing it the right way, and so that's why, in my opinion, we should not have an issue raising money. And so it's kind of, in Scalley's mind, it's kind of a two-parter, right? Being able to establish a good program, doing it the right way, whatever the right way is. I know a lot of people want to say that, and I think I know Utah thinks that they do it the right way. That's one thing they feel very strongly about. But if they feel like they're doing it the right way, that money will come. Now, is it the same money as an Ohio State or Alabama or any of these other schools? No. Utah obviously is trying to do its best to be able to compete there, and they're not going to be able to compete with those types of schools unless there's more money brought in. But that's kind of to the point of what it is. As long as you can bring a strong culture and you can quote unquote do it the right way, they feel confident that they'll be able to compete the same way that they always have, right? Now, that's not to say that, this coaching staff is just sitting there letting the times pass them by. They have to be active, right? They have to be active in all the things to be able to compete. And I think you saw that a lot in kind of how they made up this roster for the next season. They worked really hard to be able to identify the talent that they wanted to keep from the team, which is, retention has to be your number one priority. You've got to be able to keep the guys that you want on your roster. And then you've got to be able to pay, maybe not top dollar, but you've got to pay a competitive dollar for players out there. And so when you build that roster, Kyle Whittingham talked about using an NFL model to value these various positions. So essentially what the NFL does, and I'm assuming a majority of these teams are doing this way, especially now that this is becoming much more of a business, is you're looking at the value of positions. So obviously quarterback is going to be one that is going to be the highest, right? If you can get a strong quarterback that you're going to pay the highest dollar for. That's why, the Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or all these quarterbacks that are top level are going to seek top dollar. Lamar Jackson held out and was able to do well because he wanted to be able to keep the market going, right? And so you're seeing that where quarterback is always going to be your best. That's going to be where the most money is established. And then beyond that, you're then setting a dollar figure to kind of what the market is giving you. Now, in college, it's much more difficult to understand what that market is than it is in the NFL, where you have, defined contracts, things that are set out. They're public for the most part. They're private, but they're public, if that makes any sense. But as part of that, you have an idea of what it is. If I want to go sign Saquon Barkley, this is what it's going to take to sign a top-tier running back, right? And obviously the market resets at times and things are better or worse, and you've seen debates about the values of a running back in the league and kind of the frustrations there. All of that matters, but the reality is it's a living, breathing thing, right? And so the valuations that you provide in there, they change. But at least you have an understanding of, a strong defensive end is going to be one of your next highest, or a strong tackle. Some of these players, maybe a skills position player, they're going to have some value, and you're basically assigning a dollar figure to that. So essentially, Utah's done the same thing. They've essentially assigned value to various positions, and Kyle says that they put it in an Excel sheet. It'd be great to be able to see what their valuations are, especially in the collegiate level, but they've essentially evaluated these players and they're going to do their best to keep them. Now, that's not to say that, they might go off script a little bit. and try to provide more value. But at the same time, if you're paying over market value, it has a tendency to burn you, or it can reset the market to some extent. Not that Utah is going to go necessarily reset the market on stuff, but at the same time, if you have enough teams that are doing it, and a team is paying $800,000 for a $500,000 position, that has to be reset a little bit, and you have to kind of tinker with that and move it. And so Kyle talked about this offseason especially. They've done a really good job of adhering to that pretty closely, he said. There's going to be some off-script stuff, but for the most part, they're going to keep to that. Now, with that, just because a position is valued at a certain way, that doesn't mean that it can't garner more, right? There's some players where let's look at Ashton Genty, for example. Running backs are obviously, I don't want to say they're dime a dozen, but in traditional football speak, a running back is dime a dozen, right? You can find somebody that can produce, you can get somebody, and so they're generally not getting top dollar in terms of like what a quarterback does, or a defensive end, or some skilled player like that. But with somebody like him, where he's the Heisman, contender, and he's a guy that is doing something, there are, incentives that they feel like that they can add to that. And maybe that's providing more NIL from other things, the true NIL, where you're getting in, let's just say the Ken Garfs, or, some other place that is going to sponsor these guys and provide more value. That can change, right? And so it's not a set thing, but at the same time, this is something that they're going to try to stick pretty close to. It's partially why maybe some of these players that you felt have transferred from Utah, Utah didn't put up much of a fight for, or at least it looks that they didn't do that. There is a chance that they didn't, because they have valued a position, and if you weren't producing at a level where they felt like it was worth going over that, or that they felt like it wasn't, it was above market value, then it didn't matter. Now, two of those players come to mind is Cam Calhoun and Keanu Tenavasa. Two players that, starter caliber. Keanu obviously was a starter. Cam Calhoun, Kyle had said, was fighting for starting minutes, obviously was splitting time with Scooby Davis and was in that mix. But when a team throws some money at them and it's overpriced from what Utah values, there's a chance that Utah is going to let them walk, right? And, Keanu, his dad has said that Utah had given a competitive offer. Take it for what it is. I don't necessarily think he's lying. I think Utah did give a competitive offer, but at the same time, they're going to evaluate him and say a defensive lineman in this league is this, right? I don't know what that number is. I would love to know what these numbers are in a more factual way. But let's just say it was 500,000. If another school offers 800 or $1 million, is it really worth spending double for that, or getting some other players? I think Utah found this as a way to say that's the case, right? Obviously, Keanu has to make his choice, and whether it was fully money, same with Cam, that's one thing. Kyle Whittingham said, quote, it was the absolute overriding factor was NIL. And so in their view, they lost out on those two players specifically because of NIL. And I they didn't dwell too much on it, as you would expect, but I think they're okay with it, right? Like, I don't think it's okay to lose like these top talents and guys that were in your starting units and just think that it's fine. But at the end of the day, they want to stick closely to what it is. Anymore, college is becoming more of that NFL model where you do have a general manager. You have a guy that is looking at that and saying, is it worth it for us to be able to take this, right? Over the summer last year, I watched the Hard Knocks on the New York Giants. They invested heavily into a quarterback that they ended up cutting midseason. They spent a ton of money into him. They decided that was their path, even though quarterback was still kind of that if thing that they were going for, and they decided not to value Saquon Barkley. Obviously, Saquon left to go to Philadelphia, has had a phenomenal season, and you can go rewrite history and say, what happens if New York would have invested in Saquon. Who knows, right? But that's the job of these general managers, is to look at this and say, you know what, this is where we feel like our value is. This is what we feel like we can get. Even though those numbers are there, there's still going to be a lot of give and take, right? You've got to be able to say, okay, if we need a new quarterback, can we even get one? At least to the level that we needed to compete, right? And so you looked at this year where they were able to get Devin Dampier. Obviously, things were in their favor in the sense that you're bringing over his offensive coordinator. But Jason Beck said there was no guarantee that he was coming there. But you look at that and you say, okay, can we get him? Is this the investment that we need to make? And so you take that money and you move forward and do that. And so, it's going to be really interesting to see how this all works, how that in the collegiate world it works, because a lot of this is behind closed doors. We're not going to be able to see fully what a guy paid for. We're not going to see their production level to the extent of what they paid. And so unlike in the NFL where we can say, okay, he was paid, $10 million to do this and he was terrible at this, or he was great at this, they got overvalue, they got undervalue, that kind of stuff. We're still kind of guessing that to some extent. There's, offhanded stuff that we can hear. There's people that will tell us as reporters some stuff. But NIL is a very tricky thing. Regardless of what that nature is, it's going to be interesting to see how these general manager roles continue to move forward. And the teams that have found a consistent way of doing things, just the same as the teams that have done this in the NFL, are generally going to be able to have the most success. You're going to have teams that are overspending and they're not able to do much. There's teams that are underspending. There's teams that have to find that right balance. And I think Utah's kind of in that mix, trying to figure out if they've found the right balance. This offseason is going to be a big test to what that is for this next year, right? If in 2025, Utah can excel and they can get back to their winning ways and be a conference title contender, it's real easy to look back and say, okay, they have the right formula in place. But that also doesn't, factor in, the talent and all that. Like, there's a lot of factors that go into this. So I'm really fascinated by what this means. I hope we get more clarity on this in the future and kind of what they value and different things that way. But let's just say that, if the NFL system is in place and you can see what their values are, that's similar to what Utah is going to be. So leave that for what it's worth. But that's kind of the nature of it. So kind of sticking more at the roster management kind of side of things, Utah brought in 12 freshmen for this spring. So you get all these transfer guys that are coming in, and you've got 12 freshmen that enrolled early that are going to be here for spring. That's a great opportunity for Utah to be able to get some of these guys involved early. Some of these guys, especially these freshmen that are on the defensive side of the ball, but there are some skills players. There's a running back. There's some quarterbacks in there that are going to be in the system. That all bodes well for Utah. And so I think that's very positive for Utah. Obviously, they still have about half of their freshman class that's going to get here in the summer. But in theory, the way Utah has changed should help a little bit, kind of helping some of these guys acclimate for fall. That's not to say that these freshmen will get on the field immediately. And I don't think there's, one freshman that you're looking at saying he has to see the field early, as we have in years past. But I think there's still a lot of good talent there, that there's potential there. And so regardless, you're getting a lot of guys in for this spring period where you're going to get some evaluations. You're going to be able to see what's going on. Utah's going to have a great opportunity to kind of fight through some of these battles in these position groups, and then use spring as kind of another springboard for a transfer portal, whether that be pushing some of these guys out. And I know that's the dirty part that nobody wants to talk about, but the more and more this becomes a business, the more and more that becomes an asset for teams, right? If you're going to sit here and pay players, there's a real reality where you're going to push them out the door as well. And it may not be to the extent of like an NFL or a professional league where you literally fire them or cut them, but there's going to be an emphasis where you say you're not going to be part of the future plans, right? And then let them decide. So there still is another spring transfer portal window, and some of those things might change. The NCAA has been weighing some stuff. This year's won't, but there still will be a transfer portal in spring. It's a 10-day window. And so you're going to see some of these position group battles where, you go into this spring and say, okay, maybe Utah's deep here, or maybe they've got this, or maybe this guy is going to be the starter, penciled in starter. And some of that changes, right? I'm curious to see how much of that is public for Utah. Sometimes these coaches are getting a little bit more hesitant about giving guys opportunities in this period, just simply because they can go into the portal and then attract more money. This portal period is a little bit different, though. I would say it's much more toward development and depth. That's not to say you can't find hidden gems there. For example, Utah brought in Landon King from this portal period. And so you can find guys that can contribute immediately. But for the most part, this is going to be kind of your depth spot, right? A starter, generally speaking, hasn't in the past gone through this portal period to find a new team. It's just not a lot of time. It's really difficult to kind of see the field. And so you have to have a really good understanding of where you're at. It's not to say it can't happen, But, I'm curious to see how Utah manages that if they do, and kind of focuses on that. So as part of that, Utah has rebuilt essentially its quarterback room and running back room. All of that is turned over. The only holdover from that group is Isaac Wilson on the quarterback side. Kyle talked about Cam Rising is no longer with the team. He's no longer on the roster. Rising still has not announced his future plans, and Kyle said he's going to let him do that to whatever extent he wants to, but he said let it just be known that he's not on the roster. And so you can kind of read into that whether that means Cam Rising, he didn't enter the transfer portal, and so he's still on the team in that regard. So either he has to announce, an NFL career, or at least pursuing an NFL or professional career, or, maybe he's going into coaching. I don't think that the professional career is probably for him. And I know that's a tough look for Cam, given, the aspirations that he had, but his age, the injuries, everything are kind of going up against him. And so it's tough for him to be able to be on a professional roster. With that said, if he wants to get into coaching, I'm curious to see what happens there. I would be surprised if he starts at Utah coaching, but, things can change, and, they obviously like him, but I know it's been a tough situation for them and everything. So the Cam Rising era has come to an end, right? You're not going to see that anymore. Utah is fully embracing Devin Dampier, and we'll get more into that a little bit. But that's where Utah's at. It's a new era for Utah, as we've talked about on this offensive side of the ball, and they're going to move forward with that. As part of that, Dorian Singer is not on the roster, however, because he graduated. However, there is still that outstanding petition to the NCAA that they're trying to get him to be able to get a 5th year. The NCAA, as I mentioned previously, is working to be able to get that passed, right? Still don't know if that means for future players or players that are currently on a roster, if that'll have any extent on players that have already expired their eligibility. Regardless, Dorian Singer has a mutual interest with Utah to be able to come back. He wants to be able to be there. He can't participate fully with the team. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if there's not some kind of backdoor stuff to say, hey, here's what we're working on in the offseason, especially if Dampier's there because of his brother. There's things that he can learn about what Utah's going to do. He's obviously been through the system with Utah, so he has a good understanding of it. But if he wants to be able to be with this team, it's going to have to be an NCAA petition that has to be passed. So today in the basketball world, there was one that kind of allowed for some more eligibility. It's trending that way. I think people feel really positive that Dorian Singer will be with the team in fall. Whether that happens, though, remains to be seen. So plan for him is like a great day, but you kind of have to look at what Utah has on its roster right now and kind of plan without him just to be safe. Obviously, if Utah does get Dorian Singer back, that's a huge boon to the program. That gives that offensive side of the ball a massive amount of growth from what they already have. They've done really well in the transfer portal, and we've gone over all that stuff, so I don't need to get into that. But that becomes a great opportunity for Utah. So curious to see what happens there. But let's jump into the offensive side. So this is the first time we've gotten a chance to talk to Jason Beck and kind of get his take on what he wants to do at Utah. As we've talked about, he does love more of an RPO, a spread style game, but curious to see how that would fit under a Whittingham style. And so what Whittingham said is, quote, it's going to be more wide open, more spread formations, a lot of Q run game, not as much tight ends. That's his simple explanation of what it's going to be, which fits a lot of what, Beck has run in the past. There is a lot more spread formations. He obviously uses the quarterback to run a ton. Dampier is that perfect guy as a dual threat quarterback to be able to be in there and run the ball. He's also a great passer that they want to see improve. And they haven't used as many tight ends. But Beck says it's all about identifying your best players. He said it's putting them in positions to have success and to play well. A lot of time that's driven through the quarterback. It starts with him. It starts with the O-line, with what they can do, and then it goes to the other skilled people around it. But it's QB-centered, and it's a play to your personnel. So similar to what Ludwig said, right? Andy Ludwig was a former offensive coordinator. He tried to draw it up around his personnel as well. Now, a lot of offensive coordinators are generally trying to go towards that, right? Where you're looking towards your personnel and gearing up to what they have. but it doesn't always work. And for Utah, that was last year queuing in on Cam Rising and his strengths, right? And so they wanted to emphasize passing the ball a lot more. They wanted to be able to do a lot of things with him, expecting him to be able to be in that system. So this doesn't fall too far away from what Ludwig did in terms of trying to scheme towards your personnel, but I think the way that Utah has identified talent and brought in talent is vastly different. They're emphasizing more of that run game. They're emphasizing more of spacing. They're trying to be able to have that quarterback be involved in the run more. And so you're going to get a lot more things there. Beck says he's going to, quote, tweak some of the things based on that personnel. And so, I'm really fascinated to kind of see what happens there, what they do. It's going to, like he said, it's going to be very QB centered. And so whatever that QB does is going to benefit that, right? Kyle Whittingham said their ideal, and this is a massive ideal, is they want to be able to have 6,000 total yards at the end of the season. And that's broken up into about 3,500 passing yards and 2,500 rushing yards. So it's a good balance, right? Obviously, it's more passing, and it needs to have more passing. That's just a nature of college football. But there's still a heavy emphasis on rushing. He said that equates to about 500 total yards per game. He said, quote, "You're really humming along if you're able to get that." And he's not wrong. New Mexico last year, with Jason Beck calling that offense and Dampier running the offense, they finished with 5,800 total yards, which was about 484 yards per game. So right there, right? They were the fourth best team in the country. Only two teams in the country this last year finished over 500 yards per game, and that was Miami at 537.2 and Ole Miss at 526.5. If Utah is in that mix, this is a very good thing for that offense, right? I don't know if they're going to be there, but if you can get anywhere near that, if you can get to 6,000 total yards in a season and you have the defense that Utah has, Utah's going to be in the playoff, right? Like, I feel fairly confident in saying that. Obviously, Ole Miss and Miami, they missed out on it, but I think there's, the defense, wasn't always there. But I feel very confident in saying that if Utah is able to obtain that ideal goal, then they have a very, very strong shot of being able to be in the playoff. Now, it's easy to be able to say that in January, right? Last year going into the season, there was a lot of talk about, on paper, this was a team that can do X, Y, Z, right? We thought about how it was going to work, and Cam Rising was going to be the savior of this, and everything was going to be great with the skills players on the outside, and Dorian Singer was going to be a 1,000-yard receiver and all this stuff. And the reality is it has to be able to play out on the field. You have to like what is going on, and you have to like what the system is in place, right? This feels far more similar to what teams are generally running in the modern college football system. It becomes much easier for players to acclimate to it, and it allows them to really just kind of hone in on the best players. So it's one of those things where Beck calls it his circle of trust. He's trying to find those 11-ish guys, those starters that he can put in his circle of trust. And if that means it's 2 tight ends, he's going to do it. If that means it's, staying true to his 2 running back system and using the quarterback as kind of that third rusher, that's going to be what it is. But he's trying to find that circle of trust that he can put in there. So there may be times where there's 12 personnel. There may be 11. He said when he ran it at Syracuse, it was only 10 personnel. And so it varies on kind of the systems that he wants to operate. Obviously, Utah has to execute at it, but he's trying to identify that circle of trust that he wants to be able to move forward with. And whatever that makeup is, we'll get to see, right? We'll get to see some of that in the spring, get to see how they utilize that. You've got to be able to kind of be productive and effective. And, that allows Beck to be much more dynamic with what he's got out there. You can have different plays drawn up for, maybe you have a circle of trust A, a circle of trust B, and then you have those different play calls for him, right? Having Wayshawn Parker in that backfield as a proven guy is going to help. Having guys that have been under Beck's system, that's going to help. All those things are going to be a great opportunity for Utah, but they still have to capitalize on it. They still have to go win the games. You can't win championships on paper, as we found out, especially this last year for Utah. Things happen, injuries happen, and it's going to be fascinating to see. But one of the fascinating things to me is getting Morgan Scalley's take on this offense. Obviously, it's his job to be able to look at these and be able to kind of find ways to tinker with them and mess with them so that it causes problems on the offense. But he said he's studied this offense, and he says, quote, "It creates problems for defensive coordinators for a multitude of reasons. The formations into the boundary, the shifts in motion, the QB run game, a lot of these things, changing personnel groups as you go throughout a series." If you've gotten a chance to watch any film on what Beck did at New Mexico, is that last part, is he does change the formations and the personnel groups throughout a series. So he'll have certain looks that he has, and he'll utilize them and try to get down the field, and then he switches it up to try to make it confusing to the defense so that they don't get stuck, right? The biggest problem that Utah's had for the last few years is they stayed pretty vanilla with what they did. There was one way of doing things, and there were some slight variations on it, but they didn't get out of their way, right? Everybody knew going into that if this player, when Mike Mitchell ran out onto the field, it was obviously a 3rd and short situation, and he was going to run the ball. They knew that in this situation, it was going to be an inside zone. They knew in this situation, it was going to be a pass to the boundary, or it was going to be a pass to, up the seam to a tight end, or whatever it may be. And so it became very easy to be able to defend. Utah still found ways to execute it when they had a quarterback that could do well, but for the most part, when you didn't have that quarterback that could execute it at a high level, it was real easy to defend a Utah offense. Under Beck, the theory is that with these changing personnel groups and these different things throughout a series, that gives Utah much more opportunities to be explosive, to be giving, or to make the defense guess, right? The more you can make the defense guess and get them to kind of say, okay, this is how they've done it, but now suddenly they've got this little wrinkle where you've got this player in this spot, that's exactly what they're trying to do. Right. And so if Utah can fully execute on this and Beck can be successful, this provides a great opportunity for Utah. There were several times where Utah, we've talked about this several times about how Utah was within these 1-score games. And if not for a few possessions or a touchdown here or touchdown there, they win these games. If Utah can execute on this and they can live up to this standard, and Dampier can be a good guy in terms of production, and you can get all these players to kind of produce at the level that you hope that they produce, obviously this becomes a great opportunity for Utah. And I know it's really easy to say, this offense is going to be so much different than Utah's last year, and sure, it should, right? But it's easy to kind of be excited about these things because you're seeing the changes that they're making. Once again, they still have to go out there and produce. Once again, all these other teams out there are doing things to try to take that away. You look at a team like Arizona State has had a phenomenal transfer portal window. They've brought some guys in. They're going to improve as well. And so as much as Utah's trying to improve and get rid of their weaknesses, all these other teams are doing it as well. And it's going to come down to what team can do it the best, what team can have the most production, and so we'll see. So it's easy to sit here and talk and be excited about this Utah offense and what it does, but realizing that there's other factors that go into this, right? When we talk about this in 9 months or so, is Utah actually executing at that level? I don't know. We'll find out. We'll get a good idea from spring in terms of what it could look like to some extent. But you're still going to get a pretty vanilla base type look that doesn't give too much away. But I think you're still going to see a lot more dynamic play. So looking a little bit at these quarterbacks and running back room, Dampier comes in. We've talked about him a lot. Obviously, they're really excited about him and his true dual threat abilities and being able to have him, Kyle was really enamored by the fact that he only took 4 sacks last year with kind of a worse offensive line than what Utah's expected to have. He gets out in space. He's able to find areas where he can either throw the ball or he just is able to weave out of that to be able to get out of the position. So they're really excited about that, especially with pairing that with Utah's offensive line. They feel like they can do a lot there. A guy that only takes 4 sacks generally has that ability to be able to get himself out of harm's way or to be able to do what he can to just get out of it, right? But with that, they feel like they're in good shape at quarterback. Kyle said, they've got a lot of talent there. Obviously, you've got Nate Johnson coming back in as a quarterback. You've got Isaac Wilson that's in the system. I know their plan is to try to keep him as more of a red shirt to be able to help him develop. But you've got, other guys in that system that they feel confident in it. And if you can continue with that and Dampier can stay healthy, they feel confident in what they have. But to that point, Whittingham said, it's easy to feel confident now, but for the last 2 years, we've gotten to our 5th string quarterback. And so it's true, right? Obviously different circumstances, but they feel like right now they have the depth that they need. They've got, a proven guy that's done it in New Mexico. They've got another guy that's gotten experience with Brug. I can never say his last name very well. We'll get there. You've got that. You've got Isaac Wilson. You've got 2 freshman quarterbacks that are coming in there. You've got Nate Johnson. You've got guys that are going to be in that system that are much more experienced than what Utah's had these last few years. And so there's optimism that things will be there. So Dampier, as I mentioned, they're hoping that they can get his numbers up, passing numbers, I should say. Obviously, he's got a great opportunity in his run game. Beck feels confident that even though they do run him a lot, that he finds ways to not take direct hits as much. It's not the Cam Rising style of play where you're going to go head on into a guy and absorb those hits, right? They feel like he does a good job of being able to maneuver in a way that if he does get hit, it's not going to be too difficult, right? Now, things happen, right? I think there's been a lot of talk about training and different things that way and what Utah can do to help. The reality is some of these things, these players, all it takes is, planting your foot the wrong way and you tear an ACL. You do something where you twist an ankle or, these are things that happen, and it's not always a hit. But they feel confident in what they have, that if that were to be a situation that they face, they've got the talent and the depth to be able to do it. So we'll see. Just for the sake of all of us, from reporting, from fans, let's just hope that Utah can get their quarterback to go through a majority of the season so we don't have to deal with that drama another season. So I think we're all on the same page here. Running back room, it's a complete overhaul. They're bringing in a completely new group. So you can expect Hunter Andrews to stay at linebacker. I know he's been toying with running back and at linebacker, but they want to keep him at linebacker and see what they've got there. That's not to say that he couldn't move back, but I think, you're seeing his potential there at linebacker and what he can do. That helps. So you've essentially got a whole new running back room. Nobody's holdover from last year. Wayshawn Parker is the guy that's going to lead that group, or at least he's expected to lead that group. And then you've got a bunch of other guys that are a mix of new talent as well as guys that have had varying degrees of success at their previous spots. And so they feel like they've got the depth and the talent to be able to do that. Kyle said that they want to continue to add one more through the portal. They'll go through spring camp and kind of see what they have, but don't be surprised if they try to add another. That's not to say that they will, but that's their expectation, is they're hoping to find another one. On top of that, looking at tight ends, Beck said, the thing about tight ends is it's just earned, not given. He's going to give these guys opportunities, and if they merit it, you're going to be in there, right? He emphasized that circle of trust that I mentioned, that if these guys can be in that circle of trust, they're going to be in that mix. All right, looking at the defensive side now. So looking at Morgan Scalley's side, the thing that kind of, you look at this defense and somebody was asking me, who is the leader of this defense moving forward? And there's guys that you can point to. You've got Lander Barton, you've got Smith Snowden, you've got Te'o Johnson. There's guys, right? And I could list a bunch of other guys. Kenan Johnson is coming back, and I think you could lean on him to some extent now that he's got a full year in the system. But the reality is talking to Morgan Scalley, he said the thing that they need the most is for a guy to, quote, become compelling. They need a guy that's going to bring others along with you. They weren't just focused on their development, they're bringing other guys with them. And so they're going to try to find these guys, the Devin Lloyds, the Clark Phillips, the Cole Bishops, Sione Vakis, the guys that are obviously these top-end talents that are playing in the league today, but they're the guys that are bringing people along with them. Karene Reed was another guy like that, right? Probably doesn't have the same top-end talent. Well, he doesn't have the same top-end talent as a lot of those guys that I just mentioned, but he brought guys along with them. And so as much as trying to just get the best talent, he's trying to identify players that are going to rally everybody, right? You've got your standard work that you're going to do. The Jalen Johnson, for example, he came in and he had his set way. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, but he also brought other guys along with him and wanted them to learn. Clark Phillips was that way. You've heard many people talk about how many yoga sessions that Clark Phillips would bring them to try to teach them to train their body and meditate and do different things that help them. It's all these things that go beyond just the regular practice. And if he can get players that can do that, he feels very strongly that Utah is going to have a strong leadership and culture on the defensive side of the ball. You see that from year to year. I don't think this is one of those things that you have to really question, but I think each year there's always those new questions in terms of who's going to step up. I think Utah still has those players, but he wants to be able to see more. He wants to be able to have players become compelling. So really fascinating conversation about that. I think you could go into a large conversation with Scalley about that, and he would tell you he's a great guy that is able to kind of give that stuff. Shaw obviously would be able to tell you there. Colton Swan. I mean, all these guys could tell you about the guys that they can bring along and have stories there. So with that, jumping to the secondary, Scalley, it's kind of funny because I think he feels like he's always doubted in the secondary, right? Every year, us media come to him and say, okay, what are you going to do? You don't have this, or you don't have that. You don't have the depth. And they continue to reload and produce. And they feel very confident they're in that position again. From the transfer portal, they've brought in a bunch of guys that are 6'2 plus, Blake Cotton, Donovan Sanders, Jeremiah Caldwell, that they feel are going to add to that length immediately. You've got Smith Snowden, who returns, that he feels like he wants him to be on the field more, and so they're probably going to play him on the outside more. Scalley feels like he should be an every down type defensive player, and so if you get him in the mix and play him on the outside, that helps. Scooby Davis continues to progress and continues to do some good things, and so he feels very confident in what they're able to return as well as what they're able to bring in, that this will become another secondary class that can do some good things. So we'll see. There's still some stuff there. I generally don't doubt that side of the ball because he and Shaw have done a really good job of continually getting the most out of guys. And, there may be some issues from time to time, but for the most part, this is a unit that continues to load up. Defensive line, more than ever, this becomes the question simply because you lose a guy like Junior Tafuna, Keanu Tanavasa transfers out. And so defensive line depth kind of takes a hit. But Morgan doesn't see it that way, and obviously that's his job to not see it that way. He's got to be an optimist. But I think he's also a realist too in that sense. But he feels like this is the, quote, most athletic defensive lineman we have. That he feels like that this is some of the best group that he's had in a long time, where they have the size, but they also have the speed. In the past, it's always just been kind of like, clog the lineup and do what you can there. But he wants guys with, athleticism and guys that can be able to move forward and be able to take extra weight and still be able to, rush and be able to do what you need to in that position group. He feels like Dallas Vakalahi has really progressed, especially from his freshman season, and done well. You bring back Aliki Vamahi, who's coming back for another year. You got Jonah Leia, who's put on a lot of weight. That's another guy that he's looking at as, though he's put on weight, can he continue to do that at the level that they wanted him to do it at? So they're optimistic about that. They feel like this could be a really good opportunity for them, and that kind of translates to the defensive ends as well. You've got guys that are very athletic. They can move around. They can do what they need to, and so they're kind of optimistic about that. Kind of rounding this out with the linebackers, Lavani Damuni comes back. As we've kind of hinted at, it's still been kind of a question on what he could do. He was able to get a medical redshirt season and come back. That provides a lot of consistency and depth to that linebacker unit. But now you have a guy in Jonathan Hall who, made the switch in fall camp to go from safety to linebacker and really, really bought in, right? I know it was difficult for him. I know he didn't want to necessarily move to linebacker, but he's since shown out and done really well. Scalley says he's, quote, going to be a star in this league. I think that says a lot of what he can do, because Scalley doesn't kind of throw that around just to throw it around. You saw a lot of that at the end of the year where Hall was in the mix in a lot of different things, right? He was one of the most relied on linebackers back there. to be able to add to that mix. And so I think you're going to see a lot of progression from him, especially as he has a full offseason to be able to actually play in that position instead of just a fall camp and going through the season. So there's that. Lander Barton continues to get better. I think a lot of people don't realize how difficult it was for him to kind of get back into being 100%. And so they feel like he's getting there. He's, 100% from his rehab, and now he's really getting back into it. They're optimistic that you're going to go and see a lot of strides from him as well in being able to move forward. So, but he feels completely confident in this with Colton Swan teaching them, says he's one of the best teachers at the University of Utah. And so there's a lot of optimism. So, as you can expect, in January, there's a lot of optimism about your team, right? I don't think there's anybody selling pessimism or that anything is bad. And I don't think there is a reason to yet, right? I don't think there's a reason to look at it and say, okay, this is a team that's just never going to get back to where they were. I think they've done well. I said missing a bowl game was probably the best thing for Utah just so that they could rebuild the way that they needed to. Trying to rebuild an offense while still trying to plan for a bowl would have been kind of, a distraction. That sounds funny because usually you talk about these bowl games as kind of added benefit to get some of these younger guys more time. But I think this team needed a full reset. They needed time to be able to kind of just break away from it, find guys that were going to be able to buy into that culture that we talked about and embrace it. So I think, Utah, as of right now, they're still on the upward trend, right? I don't think this is a team that's taking a step back. You can say took a step back based on how these last two seasons have gone. You can have your excuses for why each of they are, whether that's injuries or inconsistent play or recruiting or whatever that may be. And you're probably right in a lot of those facets, and we've documented a lot of that. But I think this is a program, that's still top of mind, right? I don't think there's worry that they're gonna fall. I think there's more hope that Utah can be back up to being a championship contender than being where they were last year. So I think the fact that last year was kind of an anomaly and, you lose 7 straight games and had one of your worst seasons in Whittingham's tenure and you're still in the mix in a lot of these games kind of shows that Utah's not that far off. That's not to say that they can't have another 5-7 season, right? If things don't change and you're not able to get the effectiveness that you need to, especially on the offensive side of the ball, you're going to be right back there. So really curious to see how this works. I would have to imagine that this is likely Kyle Whittingham's last season, especially with kind of the lead up to how this last season was. But if they can do that in a way where he feels optimistic about it, it's a great turning point into Morgan Scalley era and being able to move forward with that. So we'll try to break down some of this stuff more as we go on, but that's kind of what's going to leave us some breadcrumbs until we get to spring. So that's kind of it for football. So let's transition briefly to the Runnin Utes. I don't want to keep this podcast going on too long. But the Runnin Utes, they're kind of on a hot streak right now. They're, 2-game win streak in the Big 12. And, it's coming against Oklahoma State and TCU. Oklahoma State, they've had opportunities where they've been competitive in games, but for the most part, it's just not a team that's going to be in the mix in the Big 12. Much more akin to a Utah-type team where you're down at the bottom of the standings, right? But Utah did well, ended up winning by 21 last week. Really kind of gave them their first win and kind of jump-started what Utah's able to do. And then on Wednesday, they went down to Fort Worth and beat TCU 73-65, led wire to wire. Honestly, probably one of the best performances from Utah in conference play. Well, obviously, it's the best performance in conference play. But I think it was much more similar to what Utah looked like in the preseason. And I say that in terms of there was an emphasis in passing, right? There wasn't a lot of guys just staying stuck in areas where, Craig calls it the ball gets sticky, right? What he means is there's not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of guys doing things. It's like a guy doing something and everybody else is standing around watching him do it. There was a lot of ball movement in this TCU game. They did really well to be able to get guys open, take better shots, be able to move it around, to be able to break defenses, and it worked, right? You led wire to wire and ended up winning on free throws of all things. So it's a good opportunity for this Runnin Utes team. I think these last 2 games look more like the team that we thought Utah would have, right? Where they're still not going to be perfect. There's still some mistakes, and, free throw shooting still needs to be cleaned up, and there's still things that they need to do to eliminate losing basketball, as Craig would say. But this is a team that is starting to look like they're getting into more of a rhythm. After the two bigs came back, Lawson Lovering and Zach Keller, after their extended injuries and stays, Utah kind of went into this lull where they were trying to figure out how to get back to that, where they were trying to figure out how to play with these two bigs, trying to play with other guys, and being able to move the ball around in a way that just kind of brought a rhythm and energy to the game. And Craig has talked a lot about trying to get back to that. And these last two games, you're seeing that. That doesn't mean that Utah hasn't gone into their scoring droughts or had problems. They have, right? And there's still things that they have to correct there. But you're starting to see a team that believes in itself. And they're starting to believe that they can be in the mix here. And even in these losses that they had to start Big 12 play, they were in the mix for quite a while and then suddenly lose it because of a scoring drought or, turnovers start to pile up. I mean, they were in the mix with Iowa State for quite a while until Iowa State decided to pull away. And so there's optimism here, right? I think you're seeing a team that is believing in itself a little bit more, but more importantly, you're seeing Craig really just kind of hone in on a rotation that it doesn't fit the standard model in terms of guys that are penciled in to be there. For example, like Amiro Little was always penciled in as the starter, and he's since been on the bench, and it's been a great opportunity for him to some extent because he can lead a second unit, but it's also changed the dynamic of this team. For the last two games, Utah has started with Mike Sheriff-Jomps, Gabe Madsen, Ezra Asar, Jake Walling, and Lawson Lovering. And, I don't know that that's a perfect science for this, but for whatever reason, that has been Utah's most effective lineup. And it's done really well. You're getting a lot of success there. Now, you can switch out Ezra Asar with Keanu Dawes, and that kind of adds to it. But you're finding that Utah's been able to be dynamic. They've got length. They're being able to move the ball. And as long as shots are falling, things are going to go well. For example, if Mike Sheriff-Jomps can able to hit that three ball, that really opens up what this team's able to do. Utah was able to do this in both of these games with Gabe Madsen really still struggling. Looking at Madsen, he did have 17 against TCU, but 6 of those came at the free throw line at the end of the game. He only had 9 points against Oklahoma State. He did have kind of a breakthrough, so to speak, in that Iowa State game where he scored 20. But beyond that, he's had 4 games before that where he's led less than 10 points. He's shooting 11 of 48 from three-point range over the last 7 games. It's only 22.9%. Madsen hasn't been anywhere near that in over his career. Last year, he was at 38.6% with about 7.4 threes made a game or taken a game. This year, he's about 35.9% at 8.5 threes taken a game. Each year he continues to take more threes, but his percentages have stayed relatively the same. In 22, he was 39%. In 23, he was 36.9%. He's relatively the same. So he is in a scoring slump, and he's got to find a way out of that. And if he can find a way out of that, I think that changes this dynamic of the team even more. Because if you've got this team that is pass heavy in the way that they've been able to do it and moving around and playing with each other, playing some inside out, Lawson Lovering has provided some phenomenal minutes over the last few games, done a really good job of being able to be both aggressive but a great passer, being able to clog up the lanes. He's done a great job of playing that inside out game that works. And if that inside out game works, which it has for Utah with Ezra Asar and Keanu Dawes and Lawson Lovering, if they can also get that outside game out where those guys can then pop it out and Gabe Madsen hits that three or Mike Sheriff-Jomps does that or Jake Walling, this becomes a very dangerous team. Now, there's still a team that's, where they are in the standings and they're not going to necessarily contend at the top, but I think you're seeing a team that can eventually get to where they need to, where if they're able to eventually, peak at the right time, maybe they are dangerous in March, right? I still don't think they get to the NCAA tournament, and the only way to do that is to win the Big 12, which is a difficult challenge in and of itself. But you're seeing a team that may be peaking at the right time. Will that be enough for this team? I don't know. We'll see. Obviously have a tall task tomorrow, Saturday, against BYU on your home floor at the Huntsman Center. But you beat BYU, and suddenly the kind of tone around this team maybe changes, right? You have a team in BYU that has spent a ton of money to be able to bring in a lot of talent, guys that are projected to be top picks in the NBA draft. You've got a guy that they talk about as being this great NBA caliber coach. And there's no doubt that he is, but he hasn't coached in the collegiate ranks. And, they have the number one pick in college being able to come to the team next year. There's a lot trending in BYU's favor. But if Utah can kind of go reset that, that bodes well for them, right? Still don't know if that gets them to the NCAA tournament. Obviously, there's a ton of work needs to be done. Utah would have to go on a massive winning streak or go win the Big 12. But if you can feel optimistic about this team, I think that helps. And I think that helps Craig in kind of his future progression at Utah, if there is future progression at Utah. So as part of that, some of those lineups have been Keanu Dawes getting more play, right? And I know a lot of people have been frustrated with his play in terms of not getting to play. But there's been some things based in practice and some of the things that he needs to do as kind of a younger player that Craig has been trying to emphasize, right? He's trying to get him to emphasize certain things so that when he is on the court, he can see that playing time. Some of that is not fouling as much. He's been much better at not fouling. Early on, he was getting 3-4 fouls easily in a game, quickly took him out of the game. Lately, he's been getting maybe 1-2 fouls, been able to play physical while still playing, on the court. And so these last two games, he's had 21 minutes and 23 minutes, had 16 points in each of these games as one of the leading scorers, getting a ton of rebounds, getting blocks, steals. He's providing an energy to the team where, just these monster dunks that he throws down, it just gives kind of that confidence, right? Where he's willing to go into the lane and just wreak havoc on these opposing teams. And when you start having that kind of play, it really kind of carries over to others. As much as, a dunk doesn't look like a high energy, well, it does look like a high energy play, but as much as it doesn't look like it will facilitate shooting, it does in the sense that you've got guys that are willing to fight. You've got Lawson Lovering that's in there now in the mix where he's trying to fight and he's getting dunks. You've got a big out there that's putting in that work. And when those bigs put in that work, you know that you can beat them in an inside-out game, and then if those shots start falling on the outside, how much better can you be? And it's just been that kind of level of basketball for Utah in these last two games. Now, there's still, like I said, things they have to clean up. They can't go on these shooting droughts. They've got to be able to have more scoring. They can't continue to just have these moments where one guy does things and everybody else kind of just stands around. Defensively, there's times where you've got to have the right guys out in front of you as well. There's some guys that are getting blown up and become a liability, but maybe their upside is on offense. So it's a challenge. You have a guy like Caleb Lohner and Mason Madsen. They've been losing minutes. Whether that's their own personal struggles or that's Craig seeing less faith in them in different sides of the ball, whatever whatever it has been, Craig has been able to find some success. So really fascinated by that. This Saturday I think is going to be a telling moment for Utah and what they're able to be. If they're able to carry that forward, hopefully, in their view, have a crowd that will support them. This is the game that generally gets the most, and the Huntsman Center is usually pretty full. It'll be a raucous place, obviously, with BYU fans wanting to come out there. Utah fans are going to continue to fill that place and do it. So this becomes a great opportunity for Utah to go on a 3-game winning streak, really kind of take over some of the narrative that's been about them, and we'll kind of see what happens. But really fascinated by that, seeing what's going on there. I think, this is a team that has a lot of success in its future if they can continue to build on it. But to some extent, it may be too little too late for some people. So, I'm curious to see how this works. This schedule isn't going to get any easier for Utah. The Big 12 is a gauntlet, and there's not a lot of days off in between these games like there was in the Pac-12. Pac-12 was pretty standard where it was Thursday, Saturday, or Thursday, Sunday, maybe Friday, Sunday. But you knew relatively the same distance of where you're at. The Big 12, they'll schedule a game on a Monday and a Thursday, a Tuesday, whatever it may be. And so you always have to be ready. To some extent, I think it actually bodes well for teams because it keeps them without a lot of downtime and you're preparing a lot. So we'll see. I think this will be a fun game on Saturday. I look forward to kind of seeing how it goes. But with that, we're going to sign off. Sorry, it went a little long today, a lot to cover. But I hope that you're able to have a good time, that everything was able to go well over this last week, and that you're enjoying the Utah athletics. Please hit me up if you have any questions or anything you want me to talk about. We'll continue to go through this in the football offseason as well as going through the full basketball season. Maybe things will trend up for them. So with that, we'll sign off today, and we will hit you again next week, and we'll call it good. Thanks. Have a good one.